All right, diving in. We've got a ton to unpack today, folks. Listeners sent this really fascinating mix of stuff, articles, videos, even some handwritten notes, all about, you guessed it, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
And not just any time period. We're zeroing in on the fallout from those October 7th attacks.
Yeah, that's some heavy stuff. Definitely not your typical news cycle fodder.
Right, and that's kind of the whole point of this deep dive, right? To take you beyond the headlines into the nitty-gritty.
Exactly. Strategic analysis, historical context, the stuff you don't always get on the evening news.
And to help us navigate all of this, we're going to lean on the insights of Jacques Baud.
Okay, now this guy, he's a bit of a legend, right? Like, super impressive background.
Absolutely. Military analyst, former Swiss Army officer, worked with the UN peacekeeping missions, even had some involvement with NATO.
Yeah, he's the real deal. So he's bringing this incredible insider perspective to the table.
Exactly, a perspective you won't find in most mainstream media outlets.
Speaking of which, have you seen his interview on the Swissbox Conversation on YouTube?
No, I haven't caught that one yet.
Oh, you got to check it out. It's packed with mind-blowing insights. I mean, the guy doesn't shy away from challenging assumptions, which is exactly what we're going to do today.
Love it. So let's dive in. To really grasp those October 7th attacks, we need to rewind a bit, set the historical stage.
Yeah, back up the truck a little. This wasn't some random explosion of violence, right? This goes way back.
Way back, all the way to 1947 with the UN Resolution 181, ring a bell.
Vaguely. Refresh my memory.
Okay, so the goal was to create two states, one for Israelis, one for Palestinians. Sounds good on paper, right?
Sounds like a plan.
Well, you know what they say about the best laid plans? Even back then, there were these huge cultural differences in how both sides approached land ownership and negotiation.
Okay, see, I can already see where this is going.
Right. You had European Jews coming in with a very Western mindset, very, this is mine, that's yours, end of story.
Boundaries black and white. Got it.
Exactly. But the Palestinians, they came from a more Middle Eastern, Mediterranean background where things weren't so clear-cut, more fluid, you could say.
So, boom. Clash of civilizations right from the start.
Right off the bat. And that clash played a huge role in the Nakba, the Palestinian exodus, and the ongoing debate about land ownership, displacement, the right of return. That's still fueling so much tension today.
And this whole thing gets even trickier when you think about the words we use. Like Jew, Israeli, Zionist, are those all the same?
Yeah, great point. People toss those terms around like they're interchangeable, but they're not. Not all Jews are Israelis. Not all Israelis are Zionists.
Right, it's not a one-to-one thing.
Not at all. And here's another crucial point. Criticizing Israeli policy doesn't make you anti-Semitic.
Yeah, that's a really dangerous equation to make.
Yeah.
Like, I can criticize the French government without hating all French people.
Right, precisely. It's about being nuanced, understanding that a country's actions don't always reflect the beliefs of everyone who lives there.
Baud is really strong on that in his interview. He argues that a lot of the folks who critique Israeli policy are deeply concerned about what's happening to Palestinians. They're not against Jewish people. They're against actions they see as harmful.
Right, and he's pushing us to be more precise with our language, to avoid those sweeping generalizations.
Okay, so we've got some historical context. We've got our terminology straight.
Right.
Where does Hamas fit into all of this?
Hamas. To understand them, you need to understand their evolution. Started as a resistance movement, but over time, especially with that whole war on terror thing, they've become more of a political force.
Right, and adopted a more Islamist approach.
Right, exactly. It became kind of a unifying factor for them. So then you have 2006, they win the Palestinian legislative election, but then
Things go sideways, right? Disputes over their takeover. Israel slaps a blockade on Gaza.
and that's where Baud brings up this fascinating point. He says that some of Israel's actions, things like targeted killings, which a lot of people don't even consider acts of war, and the fact that ceasefires have been broken so many times, well, it all contributes to this cycle of violence.
It's like they're accidentally making things worse.
That's Baud's argument. He calls it asymmetric warfare, basically. When one side has this massive military advantage, the weaker side has to get creative.
Find your ways to fight back. Makes sense.
Right. And it leads to this question that Baud puts out there. Does Israel benefit from keeping Gaza destabilized?
Whoa, okay, hold on. That's a big claim. We're going to have to unpack that one.
Yeah.
But before we get too deep into that rabbit hole, let's switch gears and zoom in on those October 7th attacks. What happened in those first few days that really stood out, that challenged what we were being told in the news?
Well, right off the bat, there was a ton of misinformation floating around. Remember those stories about babies being beheaded?
Oh, God, yeah. That was all over social media.
Turns out, completely made up. Spread by some far-right activist, quickly debunked. but the damage was done.
It's scary how fast that stuff spreads.
Yeah.
And then there was the whole hostage situation.
Right, and even that term hostage is debatable. Baud suggests that Hamas might have been more interested in prisoners for exchange, not victims to terrorize.
So a strategic move rather than a purely terroristic one.
Possibly. But here's where things get really disturbing. The sheer number of Palestinian civilian casualties, especially children. It raises serious questions about whether Israel's response was proportionate.
Yeah, Baud argues that they basically abandoned precision strikes in favor of what he calls destruction strikes.
And the numbers are shocking. He points out that more Palestinian civilians were killed in just 1 month of Israeli bombing than Ukrainian civilians were in 20 months of war with Russia.
Wow, that puts it into perspective. All right, so we're talking about the morality of war here, right? Aren't there rules about this kind of thing?
Absolutely. There's international humanitarian law, which has these 3 core principles: distinction, proportionality, and precaution. You have to distinguish between combatants and civilians. Your response has to be proportionate to the attack, and you have to take steps to minimize civilian casualties.
And Baud is saying Israel failed on all 3 counts.
That's his argument. He points to those disproportionate civilian casualties and the fact that Israeli officials themselves admitted to dishing precision strikes. It raises some serious ethical questions. Like, you can't just use Hamas's initial attacks as a blanket justification, right? One crime doesn't erase another.
Exactly. And Baud takes it even further, connecting this to a larger point about Western hypocrisy. He uses the example of how France treated German prisoners after World War II to show that no country has a perfect moral record.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Historical context, key players, the events leading up to October 7th. It's a pretty bleak picture, but is there any hope for a different future? Any way out of this cycle of violence? Well, that's what we'll be diving into in the next part of our deep dive, but I think Baud would say that understanding is the first step.
Right, like with Hamas, there's so much misinformation out there.
Yeah.
Their updated charter from 2017 is actually much more moderate than their older one from the 80s.
A lot of people still cite that old charter to paint Hamas as solely focused on destroying Israel, when the reality is more complex.
So there's this gap between perception and reality. But even if there are potential paths to peace, it feels like both sides are trapped in this us versus them mentality.
It's exactly what the scholar Norman Finkelstein calls the Übermensch mentality.
Übermensch, what's that all about?
Basically, it's this belief in your own inherent superiority, that your group is somehow better or more deserving than the other.
Ah, got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not exactly conducive to finding common ground.
Not at all. It makes genuine peace efforts almost impossible. You have to see the humanity in the other side, even if you disagree with them.
Okay, so that's a great place to leave things for now. We've got this historical backdrop, we've identified some of the key challenges, but the big question remains. Is there a path forward? We'll tackle that in the next part of our deep dive, so stay tuned.
Yeah, it can feel pretty heavy, can't it? Like, all this history, all this conflict, and we're still stuck in the same loop. But that's exactly why we need to understand these deeper dynamics. Even if it seems hopeless, figuring out how we got here, that's got to be the first step toward any kind of change, right?
Yeah, totally. Like that saying, those who cannot remember the past, something to repeat it. Okay, so Baud's definitely given us a lot to chew on, especially when it comes to how we even talk about this conflict.
For sure, because if you've got Israeli military and intelligence officials themselves criticizing their own government, and we do have sources saying they are, doesn't that kind of tell you something's off? Shouldn't the international community be having a more critical, nuanced discussion about this?
Yeah, it's not just some random fringe group saying this. We're talking about people who were in the thick of it, who saw things firsthand.
Exactly. And they're waving red flags. We got to pay attention, Because if we don't at least challenge the main narrative, we just accept whatever we're told, well, aren't we kind of part of the problem then?
Makes you think, huh? When you look at what happened on October 7th through this lens of asymmetric warfare that Baud talks about,
Yeah.
it's almost like Israel's playing right into Hamas's hands.
That's the crazy part, right? Their tactics, the ones that are supposed to make them safer, they might actually be creating more chaos, more anger, more enemies in the long run. It's this self-perpetuating cycle, just reaction after reaction, and things escalate even further.
So basically, a self-fulfilling prophecy. They try to wipe out a threat with overwhelming force, but that force itself creates even more threats down the line.
That's a big part of what Baud's getting at. He wants us to move past this simple good guys versus bad guys story. We got to deal with the messiness of it all, the power imbalance, all the historical baggage, the stuff that happens when you intervene militarily that you don't always see coming.
And let's not forget the information war that's raging alongside all the actual fighting.
Hmm.
We saw how quickly those lies about the baby spread. It's obvious people are feeling really intense about this on both sides, which makes it that much harder to figure out what's actually true.
Absolutely. It's like everyone wants a simple answer, wants to know who the heroes and villains are, but it's just way more complicated than that. And that's what Baud's really pushing for, you know? Intellectual honesty, a willingness to look at the nuances instead of falling back on these easy generalizations that don't really help anyone.
It's about remembering that even in the toughest situations, we still have to make space for talking, for trying to understand each other, for seeing each other as human beings, even if we disagree, or even if we see each other as the enemy.
Exactly. And that leads us to this really important question. What can we do? Like you and me, the people listening, what can we actually do to make things even a little bit better?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Where do we even begin?
Well, I think it starts with us, each of us recognizing that we're not powerless. The first step is always education, right?
Yeah.
Looking for information from different sources, engaging with different points of view, being willing to question our own assumptions.
Yeah, it's so easy to get sucked into that emotional reaction, to just retreat into our own little echo chambers where everyone agrees with us. But that's not how you solve problems, is it?
Nope, not at all. We need to be more thoughtful, more informed. We need to acknowledge how complicated this whole thing is and try to understand where everyone's coming from.
Okay, so education's key, but are there things we can actually do? Actions we can take?
Tons. We can support organizations that are working towards peace and reconciliation. We can push our own leaders to prioritize diplomacy and finding solutions that don't involve violence. We can have respectful conversations with people who see things differently than we do. Even just talking about this stuff, like we are now, that's a step in the right direction.
Right, it's about realizing we're not just bystanders here. We have choices, and what we do and say, it matters. Even small actions can contribute to something bigger.
You got it. This deep dive's been a real eye-opener. Even for me, Baud's insights have definitely challenged some of my own assumptions, given me a lot to think about.
Same here. It's obvious there aren't any easy answers, but hey, at least we're asking the right questions now.
That's the key, isn't it? Asking those tough questions, facing those uncomfortable truths, admitting when we don't know everything. It's a process, and it's not always easy.
But if we want to break free from this cycle of violence and build a future where peace and justice actually have a chance, well, it's got to start somewhere.
No.
So if you could pick one thing, what's the most important takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with from this deep dive?
I think the biggest thing is realizing this isn't some far-off conflict. It's not just their problem. This thing, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it has these ripple effects that reach everywhere.
Yeah, like global instability, you mean?
Yeah.
And how it fuels extremism.
Exactly. And it chips away at trust in those international organizations that are supposed to be keeping the peace. It makes it harder to solve all these other problems we're facing globally. Think about it. If we can't even figure out how to deal with this, what hope do we have for tackling climate change or poverty or any of those big, scary issues?
So it's not just about Israelis and Palestinians. It's about what kind of world we want to live in.
Exactly. Are we going to keep going down this road where whoever's got the biggest guns gets to call the shots? Or are we going to try to build something different? A world based on law, on dialogue, on respecting each other, even when it's tough. How we respond to this conflict, it says a lot about what kind of future we're creating.
Yeah, I'm starting to see that. It's like Baud's analysis really highlights how history isn't set in stone. We're not doomed to just keep repeating the same mistakes. We have choices to make, things we can do right now. You and me, everyone listening.
And it starts with holding those in power accountable, right?
Yeah.
Questioning the stories they're selling us, demanding more from our leaders. It's easy to get caught up in the blame game. They started it. No, they did. But that's a dead end.
It can feel so overwhelming, though, right? Like, what can one person really do? But that's how these problems just keep getting worse, isn't it?
Every voice matters. Every little act of courage, of compassion, of understanding, it all adds up. We can't just sit this one out. If something doesn't feel right, if the facts don't add up, we got to say something.
Okay, so get informed, challenge the status quo, make our voices heard. But what about solutions? What does a path forward even look like? Can there even be a just and lasting peace in this situation?
I think so, but it's got to be a peace built on addressing the root causes, not just putting a Band-Aid on things. And that means going beyond just Baud's perspective, as valuable as it is. We need to hear what Palestinian intellectuals are saying, what Israeli peace activists are saying, what international mediators are proposing, everyone.
We mentioned that 2017 Hamas charter earlier. how it's a bit more moderate than their previous one. Could that be a starting point? Maybe?
It could be, but it also means really listening to everyday Israelis, taking their security concerns seriously, but not by building more walls, more checkpoints.
Yeah, but that seems to be the direction things are going in now. More walls, more division.
Ah.
How do you break through that?
Well, one thing that kept coming up in those sources you sent was this idea from Norman Finkelstein. Remember that whole Ubermensch thing? He says both sides are stuck in this cycle of dehumanizing each other. And as long as that's happening, making any real progress is going to be almost impossible.
Powerful stuff.
Mm.
But how do you get people to see that, especially when there's been so much hurt, so much loss?
It's tough, no question. But it starts with talking to each other, with really listening, with challenging our own biases and the stories we tell ourselves about the other. And it might mean accepting that there isn't one perfect solution, one side that's 100% right. There's going to have to be compromise.
Man, this deep dive has taken us everywhere, from battlefields to, like, negotiating tables, from ancient history to YouTube interviews. We've covered a lot of ground, but this is definitely not the end of the road.
This conflict, it's complicated, it's messy, it's emotionally charged, but the more we understand it, the more we can push for something better. And that starts with each of us.
So for everyone listening out there, we've given you a lot to think about. What resonated with you? What are you going to do with this information?
Don't let this be just another podcast that you listen to and forget about. Go check out those sources we talked about, explore those different perspectives, question what you think, ask those tough questions.
And most importantly, remember, peace isn't just some abstract concept. It's something we build every single day with every choice we make. It's a long road for sure, but it starts with each step we take.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and most importantly, don't lose hope.
That's it for us today. Until next time, keep diving deep.